Let's start off with your background. What was your interest in specializing in the subject and teaching it?
Well, I studied the history of 60s social movements, Black Power movement, and Civil Rights movement. I was working on my doctoral degree, and the dissertation that I did ended up being my first book called Fighting for Us. And that's about the US organization, the group that started the holiday Kwanzaa. And that's an organization that really saw itself as fulfilling an aspect of Malcolm X's unfinished political project. And so that sort of led me to want to really discuss with graduate students all of the different sides of Malcolm X. So that culminated in my interest in putting together a graduate course on Malcolm X.
Tell me, what are some of the things that you teach to your students? Like, what aspects of Malcolm X?
Well, I think one of the important things you learn in the story of Malcolm X, particularly in the written literatures about Malcolm X, is the role of interpretation. So Malcolm X didn't actually get to see the representation in the autobiography. That was a collaboration with Alex Haley. And so even looking at the autobiography and discussing what might be the things that the collaborator added to the story, what things are Malcolm's voice, what things are affected not only by that collaboration, but the time period that Malcolm X writes the book. So there's a period in the early part of the autobiography where he's still with the Nation of Islam. By the time he finished the book, he's left the group. So how do those changes in organizational affiliation affect how he sees the past and tells his story? And so the course really starts with the autobiography, and then we branch off into the different ways that historians have interpreted Malcolm X's legacy.
Do you think some of the things in his political career that he experienced, do you think some of those messages are relevant today, especially for young people to know kind of the messaging that he had, like what things they could take away and learn from it, or even if they apply to kind of today's climate?
There's so many rich things in Malcolm's story, particularly now that we talk about the impact of mass incarceration. We think about, okay, what kinds of ways can we, who are not a part of that population, what things can we do to support those who are incarcerated so they can transition and make contributions? Malcolm X also shines a light on the fact that so many important persons become politicized while incarcerated, as Malcolm X would interface with the early version of the Nation of Islam while he was incarcerated. So there's a very rich story there. There's also in Malcolm X a cultural story that highlights the relationship between Black youth and popular culture. Malcolm X may have been called a hip cat at one time. He wore a zoot suit. He listened to swing jazz. Swing jazz was the hip hop of its day. It was associated with a certain kind of lifestyle, a certain kind of speech, a certain vernacular. And Malcolm X was a product of that as well. So you get so many different discussions and opportunities to discuss culture, youth culture, cultures and youth cultures that are criminalized or seen as disruptive. One aspect of being a zoot suiter that was very oppositional was that they were wearing excessive amounts of clothing at a time when the country was being called to ration its consumption because of the wartime prohibition against excessive consumption. So there are lots of ways that we can think about what is edgy, what is mainstream, what is conservative, and how these representations shift in different contexts. And Malcolm X is someone who comes out of a radical, progressive, Black nationalist background. Family is disrupted by political violence of the Klan. He ends up being a part of the urban young person who's caught up in street life, gets to prison and finds a way to repoliticize himself again, comes out, organizes the Nation of Islam, and then also grows to become a critic of the Nation of Islam, and then becomes a very important leading figure in laying out some of the tendencies that are going to explode after he dies at 65 with the Black nationalists and Black power movements.
Now, do you think because he had so many different sides to him, just even in his life, that's why he's so popular today? Everyone can kind of pick something maybe they relate to or admire about him?
That's part of it. I think also it's part of that age-old American fascination with individual triumph. And so much of his story is appealing in ways that may not even be that radical when you think about it. The idea of someone sort of willing themselves to heights that others would not anticipate. So there's that aspect of the story. The other reason why so many people, I think, find a space in their own ideas for Malcolm X is because that formation of the Organization of Afro-American Unity that was really going to be this very important umbrella political organization that would be focused on building consensus. Well, we only had a year or so of that. And as a result, there's so much in the founding documents of that organization, the early visions of that organization that was not fulfilled. There's lots of room to interpret the directions. So cultural nationalism of the US organization that started Kwanzaa, they refer to a speech that Malcolm X gave that says, we must unbrainwash an entire people. We have to have a cultural revolution. Political nationalists who are interested in a separate nation state or some form of Black political autonomy can find lots of references in Malcolm X to support that. Even those who are leaning more toward a socialist perspective, when Malcolm starts to talk about the problem of dollarism and the global political economy. He's in dialogue with leaders of the anti-colonial movements in Africa. So he's an international figure. The other important part of Malcolm X is he centers political action around Africa in a way that doesn't divide the Black diaspora in ways that had done so before. So he mentions things like the Bandung Conference, which had Kwame Nkrumah there. It had leaders of a lot of new independent states talking about building a consensus. He was going to the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which the OAAU is modeled after, and saying, look, African Americans need to join forces with people abroad, Black folks abroad and people of color abroad. But he's also saying Black folks in the U.S. have to find ways to build consensus in spite of their political differences. What are the core things that we all agree on? Let's focus on that rather than what divides us. And he's also talking about, he's open to this idea of a progressive coalition, even outside of the Black community too, as he starts to articulate lots of different things like that.
Coming up,
Malcolm X will always have a special place among those who are thinking about solutions to issues of race, issues of social justice, that look at what they can contribute themselves.